Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. U.S. President Donald Trump wants U.S. forces to remain at an airbase in Iraq to keep an eye on Iran. Iraqi officials and the country's top religious figures have rejected this notion, saying they do not want their country to be used as a listening post or possible launch pad. Iran has reacted as well, saying the U.S. has finally admitted why it is in Iraq, not to fight terror, but to target the Islamic Republic. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Ms. Tanya Goudsouzian, who is an analyst, and she's joining us from Istanbul. She's a journalist who has covered Iraq and Afghanistan for over 15 years. We're also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is a U.S. affairs expert. He's joining us from Washington. He's the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. And finally, we're also joined by Mr. Mehran Haghirian, who is an international affairs analyst. He is joining us live now from Doha. He's a PhD student at Qatar University. Thank you to all three of our guests for joining us here in the Scope. Tanya, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What did you make of Trump's statement about why he wants U.S. forces to remain in Iraq?
Well, President Trump has never made it a secret that he feels Iran represents the biggest threat, not only to the region, but to U.S. interests in the region. But the problem with that statement is that he not only antagonized U.S. allies in Iraq, but he pretty much played right into the hands of Iraqis who have opposed the U.S. presence in Iraq from the very beginning.
Indeed. And Michael, then one wonders, why would Trump say this? And this is obviously, Michael, after that seeming misstep, which Trump had made anyways, when he went to Iraq, visited troops there, but did not meet with Iraqi officials as well. Iraqi officials, even at that time, were quite angry about him seemingly not respecting their country's sovereignty.
Well, you would think after a couple of years in office that, excuse me, President Trump would find a little bit more expertise in the diplomatic language, ways to present things, ways to deal with other countries. I agree that this was a misstep. He was very careful about what he said the United States was not going to do. The concern is that Iraq will be used as a launch pad, and the president said, no. We're just going to keep our eye on them. We're just going to watch. He needs to be more careful in his interview language and present in a much more, I would think, internationally acceptable way the views that he has. Additionally, it would seem that there would have been some consultations with the Iraqi government prior to this, but ultimately the larger part of the policy, which is to move maybe up to 1,000 troops from the Syrian theater to Al-Assad Air Base, is not that big a deal.
Okay, so Mehran, what do you make of all this? Rouhani, as you may have read, Mehran saying that pretty much this is Donald Trump coming out and being honest about why the U.S. is in Iraq to begin with. It's not about terrorism, according to Rouhani. This is about Iran.
This is in fact true. I honestly believe that Trump, his real personality and ideas about the situation comes out particularly during these kind of interviews. When the key word here is respect for sovereignty. And if you look at the same interview when he mentioned this statement, he also said that we had Iraq. This was repeated in his interview, thinking that the U.S. policy by building this massive base in Iraq would provide the U.S. the Iraqi support required to keep the American troops in Iraq. At the same time, this is in tandem with his policies towards Syria, that he also has this view that the troops will be relocated from Syria to Iraq as well. What I really believe is that for the Iranian situation, this comes out particularly at a good time where Zarif's trip to Iraq right after the Trump's visit to the base illustrated Iran's engagement with Iraq and its commitment to expanding its bilateral, at least in economic terms, with Iraq.
Okay, So Tanya, then one wonders, at this point in time, do you think the U.S. will actually ever really walk away from Iraq, as many now MPs are talking about? And of course, many of those MPs, we would say, and I'm sure you know, are more Iran-leaning, if I may use that term.
Well, in fact, I agree with Mehran, and I'd like to add something to that.
Sure.
This, of course, I mean, I was on the phone earlier with an Iranian government advisor, and he said, well, this reminds us of the old neocon expression, real men go to Tehran. So this is nothing new for the Iranians. They didn't really bat an eyelash when they heard this statement. What this means about the U.S. troops in Iraq, I mean, frankly, you get a lot of contradictory statements coming out of President Trump. On the one hand, since he was elected, he's been saying he wants to bring his troops home. He's tired of forever wars. So he's made those statements about Syria. He's made them about Afghanistan. But now he's saying something different, that he wants to stay in Iraq. At this point, he has antagonized so many Iraqis, with the key word again to go back to what Mehran said, being sovereignty. This was an affront to the Iraqi sense of sovereignty. The likelihood is it may go to a vote to parliament, and many Iraqis will say we want them out. And if this happens, then the Americans don't have a legal basis to stay. So we have to think back to 2011 when, having failed to get a renewal of the Status of Forces Agreement, the Americans had to leave.
And Michael, then if that were to happen, if such a vote were to occur there in Iraq, can Trump, accept that and walk away?
Well, I think, given the legal status, he needs to follow the law, and he needs to follow the wishes of the government of Iraq. Now, I don't know the intricacies of the parliament in Iraq and if their vote would be final, or if there is some way to negotiate an agreement directly with the Iraqi presidency, et cetera. But absent some sort of agreement with the Iraqi government, then it would be very difficult to justify staying in the theater. I would hope that the Iraqis would understand that, what the United States is really doing there is fighting terrorism. I mean, we came back in the invitation of the Iraqi government because ISIS had overrun vast portions of the country. And so until ISIS is absolutely annihilated and defeated, which it has not yet been done, it seems that there is a real need and a justification for U.S. presence in that particular part of the country. But nonetheless, if there's no legal justification for being there, then it would seem that President Trump's hands would be tied and he would have to execute a withdrawal.
Okay, so Mehran, Trump said when he was asked if he would want to launch a strike on Iran from Iraq, he said that no, I just want to be able to watch Iran. He insisted that, I believe, twice. He repeated that. Can he be trusted? Can the U.S. be trusted on that point? If the Iraqis were to say, fine, we'll let you watch Iran, even if such a deal were to be made behind the scenes, can the U.S. be trusted not to actually launch an attack on Iran from Iraq?
Is by the two previous speakers is that Iraq was Trump and the U.S. Troops were invited by the Iraqi government to Iraq, and that justifies U.S. presence in Iraq. But at the same time, a report came out by the Department of Defense just last week, I believe, that stated that Iraq is not prepared, at least for the next 10 years even, to be prepared to single-handedly deal with terrorism and the threats that arise from it. So this creates this hysteria or even concern by the leaders even in Iraq as well as in the United States in their plans for dealing with such terrorist threats. But at the same time, it is quite possible that the parliament will vote on this, and the Iraqi parliament will vote on this and at least limit U.S. presence, or at least have more clear guidelines or agreements on what the U.S. troops will be able to do in Iraq. But it was very clear by the statements from the Prime Minister, the President, Ayatollah Sistani, as well as the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, that such statements are not really welcome by the Iraqi government, particularly because of the fact that the people will perceive this as infringing on their sovereignty.
So Tanya, what do you make of that? Do you actually think that the Iraqis may actually need the Americans to stay for a tad bit longer or even more than that? And that this has sort of muddied the waters, has made things even more difficult because, these sorts of statements have now come out into the open?
Well, let's remember what the Iraqi president, Barham Saleh, said. He reacted angrily. He said that Iraq should not be used should not be burdened by American policies. Iraq will not be part of an axis, and Iran is a neighbor of Iraq with which it has to deal. So absolutely, this statement was rejected by the Iraqi leadership and the Iraqi people. They feel that Iraq is not to be used by the Americans for their own purposes, that Iraq is a sovereign country. It really remains to be seen whether this goes to Parliament or not and what happens.
Okay, let's take a very short break right now. We've, of course, viewers, been talking about the statement made by Donald Trump about why he thinks U.S. forces should remain at that Al-Assad air base in Iraq. We'll be right back with more on that conversation after this break. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us here in the Scope, viewers. Now, before going to the break, we were talking, of course, about Trump's statement there about why he would want U.S. forces to remain at that Al-Assad base in Iraq. Michael, I wanted to bring you back in and ask you at this point, Michael, what do you think U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iraq really is? Do you think, Michael, if we're completely honest with each other, that it is U.S. policy to watch Iran from Iraq? Because, I imagine that that's a very convenient vantage point, isn't it?
It is. Honestly, I'll go back a step. I don't understand why President Trump really wants to vacate the Syrian theater. It seems to be that he believes he made a campaign promise, and that was one of the significant reasons why he was elected, and he wants to keep that promise, while at the same time maintaining the presence necessary for the U.S. to look out for its own interests. I think he fundamentally misreads the political situation domestically here. I don't hear anybody screaming for us to move 2,000 people out of Syria, maybe move half of them to Iraq and bring half of them home. There's not a heavy demand for that domestically. So it would seem to me that his mission of watching Iran could be best done by leaving the forces where they are in Syria, continuing the fight against ISIS, and continuing to keep an eye on Iran's adventurous activities in Syria and around the region. So if he's committed to keeping his campaign promise and moving those forces out of Syria, then moving them just across the border to the Al-Assad air base is a very convenient place for them to continue the same sort of activity.
So, Mehran, do you think the U.S. needs to keep an eye on Iran?
It is quite necessary, I think, for the Trump administration to bolster its Iran policies, because now we all know that the U.S. Middle East policy is fixated on Iran. Particularly looking at John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the key advisors to Trump on his foreign policy, because he doesn't really want to consider his intelligence agencies' reports, is that they are really focused on countering Iran. So at this time, whatever is being done around the region, I believe, is really fixated on how to deal with Iran. And having such statements on keeping an eye on Iran or similar things is based on that. And looking at the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear agreement, this further strengthens basically Trump's approach towards Iran to state that, yes, we are dealing with Iran in a more stronger fashion and similar things.
Okay, and so Tanya, what do you think of that? I think that for example, we can talk about many of these theaters of war in this region, can't we? When we're talking about Syria, for example, it can be argued that it's been Iran along with Russia which have essentially spoiled many of the U.S. plans possibly for Syria vis-a-vis the ouster of Assad originally, at least. That has not worked out. Possibly for Iraq as well. The Iranian influence is obviously, an effect of the U.S. invasion, which I imagine, of course, the Americans do not appreciate. Do you think that there is reason then for the U.S. to keep an eye on Iran?
Well, let me also say that there is a perception that his statement was intended more for a domestic audience rather than an international one. So, there is criticism that the Americans have essentially lost Iraq to Iran. So these kinds of statements are probably meant more to assure Americans that no, we haven't lost Iraq. We're still there. We're still keeping an eye on them. That could possibly be an explanation. But I'd like to add something else to the discussion, because one of the things that we heard spoken of right after Trump announced that he would withdraw from Syria was the possible outsourcing of the anti-Daesh operations to Turkey, a key NATO ally, an ally of the U.S. in the region. So that's something that was discussed, the possibility of Turkey playing a greater role in Iraq, one that would be less hostile to Iran, but would perhaps mitigate the perceived Iranian expansionism in the region.
I wonder what you make of that, Michael. Indeed, as Tanya there just pointed out, Turkey has been spoken of a lot recently vis-a-vis even Iraq, and of course we know its involvement in Syria as far as the Astana process, etc. goes. Do you think that's a logical path to take at this point in time, as far as the U.S. taking a step back and putting an ally forward, such as Turkey?
Well, I think President Trump thought that was a logical step to take. He had a conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey about that very thing, as well as others. In fact, the communication between President Trump and President Erdogan is much more frequent, animated, and I would say volatile these days than it was in most of the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. Where the sticking point came, as I think most of our viewers probably know, is not in Turkey's willingness to take over that part of the operation, but in the United States' somewhat belated recognition of the fact that Turkey probably didn't have the best things in mind for the U.S. allies, the Kurds, in that particular region. The United States then went back to Turkey and demanded some sort of assurances that the Kurds would be perfectly okay, and the whole thing broke down at that point. So it was a logical idea, but in the implementation, I think we're still a couple conversations away from figuring out how to do that.
Mehran, what do you make of the Turkish role?
Particularly looking at the Turkish situation and the U.S.-Turkey relations, we have seen in the past year that it has had a few ups and downs, and it is quite difficult to agree with Trump's views on delegating the Syria or the Iraqi theaters to Turkey.
Okay, so Tanya, one aspect we have not spoken yet is that of the fact that obviously the U.S. does see Iran and vice versa really as foes. And then there's, of course, the Israeli factor in all of this as well. I imagine the Israelis behind the scenes pushing for the U.S. to remain within the region to keep an eye on Iran and a lot more. Do you think that all is playing into this? And how do you think all of that is playing into this? Will this be a lot more behind the scenes now? Do you think this will be a lot more aggressive towards Iran, possibly from using other bases in this region?
Well, that may well be. There were reports that the Americans were checking out bases in the region to see where they could beef up the troops. And to be honest with you, it's really hard to find logic in Donald Trump's statements. You just have to wait for the next tweet at this point.
But Tanya, to be honest, I mean, it is logical, is it not, from the point of view where we know, as I put to you, that that these two countries have long-standing enmity. To that extent, he's just come out and said something which we've all known for so long, haven't we?
Yes, but it remains to be seen whether he's going to follow through on it. He says a lot of things, but then he doesn't follow up, or he does the opposite. So he may backtrack. We don't know. I mean, look what he did with Syria. One minute he said he's staying. Next minute he said he's leaving. Then he said he's staying for a little bit longer. He did the same with Afghanistan, where he said he's going to draw down, but no timeline was actually agreed on. So it's all speculation.
Okay, so Michael, recently we had in front of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe, a number of U.S. intelligence chiefs who came out and said, listen, Iran doesn't actually pose as much of a threat now to the U.S. national security because, its nuclear weapons program, according to them, their alleged nuclear weapons program has slowed down and or has shut down for now. They're respecting the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, etc. Why do you think it is that Trump cannot accept his own intelligence chiefs, judgments on these issues? He called them naive, I believe.
Well, that is an excellent question. I believe that the United States intelligence services are pretty professional and pretty good at what they do. Now, they're not perfect and they don't get 100% of everything 100% correct. But nonetheless, at that rather remarkable hearing that they had in front of the Senate, they were all together on the same page, indicating that as far as they could tell in their judgment, the Iranian compliance with the JCPOA was continuing. President Trump is very upfront about saying he just disagrees with his intelligence services at this point, that he's going to keep his own counsel, I think was his exact quote, and move forward based on the policy objectives that he had. I think there's a hybrid there. He doesn't have to reject his policy, his intelligence chiefs. I think he should give a little bit more weight to what they say. But even given the fact that Iran is in compliance with JCPOA, according to the intelligence chiefs, doesn't mean that the United States doesn't have an adversarial relationship with that country, doesn't mean that we have specific objectives that we'd like to pursue, doesn't mean that pulling out of the JCPOA was a bad decision. So I think that there's a hybrid there that will allow Trump to be a little bit more on the same page with his advisors and still carry out his own thing. But he continues to magnify the differences, which domestically, politically, I don't think is to his advantage either.
I wonder what you make of that, Mehran, because, the JCPOA, I imagine, is a huge factor right now, isn't it? In the region, and especially when it comes to how anyone would judge whether there will, for example, be a war launched on Iran by the U.S. or any of its allies in the region. What do you think of that?
I continue to doubt that there is any possibility of an outright military conflict between Iran and the United States. But at the same time, the JCPOA, I believe the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA was a terrible decision based on the fact that during that time it was perceived and it was really, we could all see that the level of the relations between Iran and the U.S., the hostilities were decreasing, and there was a chance that as time progresses, there could be a possibility of at least a minimal rapprochement where both countries could see each other on mutual footings. So that could have led to less hostility and as well as less threat to the U.S. and vice versa towards Iran from the U.S. side. But with Trump's withdrawal from the deal, Iran is back now even to before the Bush era, the relations with the U.S. So currently, I believe Iran is doing all it can to perceive the deal, to perceive its relations that it has built through the JCPOA and the negotiations with the European countries, as well as with the international community. And this is evidenced by the fact that the Europeans are trying very hard to perceive the deal and to appease Iran with the recent introduction of the INSTEX mechanism or other possible ways that they can help Iran to overcome the economic hardships that are caused by the new U.S. sanctions.
Very well. We're going to actually leave the final word. Time has gotten the best of us, but of course we do appreciate all of our guests and the insight and analysis they brought to this conversation. Let me thank our guests there from right at the end there. We were speaking to Mehran Haghirian, International Affairs Analyst, speaking to us from Doha. He is a PhD student at Qatar University. We're also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, U.S. Affairs expert, speaking to us from Washington. He's the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. We were also joined by Tanya Goudsouzian, analyst, speaking to us from Istanbul. She's a journalist who has covered Iraq and Afghanistan for over 15 years. Now, viewers, as all of our guests there spoke about, there are a number of facets, of course, to the statement that Donald Trump made about keeping U.S. troops, or increasing, in fact, U.S. troops at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq to watch Iran, according to him. An honest statement, possibly. That's at least how the Iranian president sees it, saying that, essentially they caught Trump speaking the truth, saying that that's why the U.S. has been in Iraq, not to fight ISIS or Daesh, as they would call it, but in fact to watch Iran, to possibly use Iraq as a launch pad, or at the very least a listening post. Iraqi officials, MPs, as well as religious figures have rejected this, saying that this is unacceptable. They do not want their country to be used as either a listening post or launch pad. We'll keep a close eye on that situation, of course, vis-a-vis Iraq and what the U.S. intentions for its base, or at least the base it uses there in that country, are. Stay with us though. I'll be back after the break with our next segment. Thank you for staying with us here in The Scope, viewers. Confusion reigns over Trump's announcement over the U.S. withdrawal from Syria. He's now asserted that ISIS-held territories will be 100% liberated by next week. But can a terrorist group and its ideology ever be defeated militarily? The other members of the anti-ISIS coalition have said that ISIS is not yet destroyed and remains a threat. Before we get to our guests, let's just play that clip of Donald Trump speaking about the defeat of ISIS.
As I noted in my State of the Union address yesterday, the United States military, our coalition partners, and the Syrian Democratic Forces have liberated virtually all of the territory previously held by ISIS in Syria and Iraq. It should be formally announced sometime, probably next week, that we will have 100% of the caliphate.
100% of the caliphate there you heard from Donald Trump. Let's now introduce our guests to discuss this a bit further. We're joined by Mr. Obaida Hitto, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from Istanbul, and he's joining us via Skype. We're also joined by Dr. Yahya Al Aridi, who is a Syrian politician. He's joining us from Strasbourg. He's part of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, and he's joining us on the line. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Al Aridi, I'll start with you, if I may. What did you make of Trump's assertion vis-a-vis ISIS and the complete liberation of territories, as he said, by the quote-unquote caliphate?
Well, when the Syrian people rose against a brutal regime, they thought that they were against a civilized or somebody who believes in human rights or anything of the sort. Unfortunately, not only the regime that they rose against, but the fabricated powers that were there by the regime itself, in particular terrorism, proved to be so brutal beyond the regime's power. Now, when the statement comes from the United States that the American forces would be withdrawn from the northeastern part of Syria because Daesh or ISIS is gone or finished, this is really a blessing for Syrians in general, because terrorism was used by the regime that I was talking about as a pretext in order to suppress, in order to kill the people. Now, with this announcement, there would be no excuse for the regime to say that there is still terrorism. Actually, from the very beginning, we know that not only the regime but other powers contributed to the creation of Daesh and its likes in order to create certain entities, certain powers that would justify for the regime to kill its own people. So its departure is really something very important, very good, although we keep in mind that former American President Obama said that it's going to take 15 years in order to defeat Daesh.
Right.
We didn't know why he said so, but now we can do some sort of interpretation of why he was saying so. Because probably he wanted to give justification for the Iranians, for Iranian militias, for the regime, to continue with their strategy against Syrian people, civilians, and use all sorts of atrocities under the pretext that there is terrorism, there's Daesh, and its likes.
Obaida, I wonder what you make of that. What are your thoughts about that?
It seems like President Trump is on his own here. The countries that are part of this global coalition to defeat Daesh, who have participated in various kinds of aspects of the operation, whether it be training or providing logistical support or even airstrikes, they are not on board with Trump's announcement of declaring the defeat of Daesh. Even the UN has put out a recent report about the state of Daesh and the state of the fight against groups like Daesh in the region, and they stated that Daesh is already making preparations for a post-defeat kind of phase. The UN says in their report that the Daesh terrorists are organizing themselves in such a way that they might conduct, destabilizing kinds of activities. They're going to be attacking, according to the UN, they're going to be attacking infrastructure and reconstruction projects. The UN admits also that they have large numbers of networks. Their core networks are still in Syria and Iraq, even if the caliphate, as President Trump says he is destroying, might be destroyed in the sense that it's an organized entity, or it's not an organized entity anymore. But these people are still living. They are still Syrian citizens. They're still Iraqi citizens. Many of them might be foreigners. They still move around in this region, and they can still gain access to their support networks. The UN estimates that they still have financial resources between $50 and $300 million. So Daesh, being a caliphate, is much more, it's beyond them controlling territory. At one point, they controlled territory that was the size of Great Britain. Today, they might not control any territory, but the threat that they pose to the stability and security of the two countries, specifically Syria and Iraq, and the region as a whole, and possibly beyond, it still exists today. And this is by the assessments of international organizations like the UN. So Trump is on his own here declaring that that Daesh is defeated. I think he's trying to cash in on his campaign promises. He has been very aggressive in trying to deliver on these promises of moving out of the region, pulling forces out of the front lines, giving the responsibility back to regional players so that they can play a more prominent role. And I think he's playing politics here because of the budget problems that he has domestically.
Dr. Al Aridi, I wonder with that, because many people would argue that Donald Trump is being a tad bit naive when it comes to understanding a group like ISIS. It's not just about territory, is it? It's about their ability to still carry out attacks and to still threaten Iraqi and Syrian civilians, but of course even beyond this region, towards Europe and even beyond that.
Well, now your guest's interpretation of this move by President Trump is justified in the sense of internal politics, internal United States politics. Because anybody who defeats Daesh, anybody who says that he defeats Daesh would be inaugurated a hero. This would play into the hands of Mr. Trump, definitely. However, when we investigate the Daesh phenomenon, if we can say so, we would realize that we have there a gun for rent. That's one.
Okay.
Second, it is an ideology rather than just some practice being carried out somewhere on a certain geography, etc., etc. And at the same time, it is used at the highest levels of dictatorship Now, the best way for dictators to justify or to find an excuse for what they do, the brutality they carry out, is to hire somebody like Daesh and to have a set like Daesh to justify or to just make what they do, make their brutality less severe, if we can say so. Now, what matters for Syrians who have been suffering for the past 8 years almost is a different story. Actually, those people devastated the country. Of course, not as much as the regime itself, because they didn't have jets, they didn't have rockets, and they didn't demolish buildings as the regime did, and displace people, try to change the demography, imprisoned 500,000 people in jails, tortured people in jails. They didn't do that, but they were not less brutal. And one important thing is that the world, due to the fact that the Syrian case has become somehow international, the world paid too much attention to ICE and diverted its attention from the brutality of the regime. And this really has negatively affected the Syrian case. And it links.
But if I may just push you on a point you just made there, Dr. Al Aridi, because you said that the world concentrated too much on ISIS's brutalities, but then that's logical, is it not, considering then ISIS started carrying out attacks across the world, really?
Well, now every terrorist act in the world now is registered under the trademark Daesh. This is what we understand. This world is full of terrorist acts at different levels. Now, with this concentration on Daesh and everything is being under its name, you would ignore, or you would this would divert the attention from the other organizations, other acts of terrorism being carried out. Now, what concerns us is our Daesh, the brand we have in our part of the world.
Okay.
If you go back to the roots of how it developed, for instance, in Syria, you would know, and this can be investigated and can be looked up in it's documented that the regime released hundreds of prisoners who have been there for years because of crimes related to extremism at ideological level. It knew very well that those people would be the future of Daesh in Syria. And many of their emirs were in Sidnaya jail in Syria, released by the regime, and now they are the Daesh of Syria. They are the leaders of Daesh of Syria. And this is really, again, this has harmed the Syrian people, has harmed their case, has diverted the world attention from the suffering they have been going through at the hands of the regime.
Okay.
And the moment Daesh disappears from Syria, it is a pleasing point for Syrians, because that excuse, that pretext will be removed.
All right, so Obaida, I wanted to bring you back in and ask you then, Obaida, about one of the points that Dr. Al Aridi there made, which I wanted to pick up on, in fact, is the fact that it seems that whenever there is some sort of terrorism anywhere in the world, really, that does now come under the brand of ISIS. Do you think that actually goes to show the strength of ISIS ideology, or is that all just we're labeling everything just as ISIS because it's just more convenient?
I think that this is a phenomenon that is something that is found or rooted in this war on terror that started in 2001 when the attack happened in New York, and then this global media rhetoric about them and us, or us and them, and you're either with us or against us. The famous line that George Bush said regarding the people who attacked New York. This entire phenomenon is tied to this kind of psyche that has swept across the world. Now, Daesh appeared to be the most extreme and the most violent, and the group with the most reach in terms of comparing to other terror groups. However, I don't believe that this gives any indication about the strength of the ideology. What I think it indicates is that this ideology is being used by many different parties and people of interest, or groups of people of interest, specific or different kinds of interests, to pursue different kinds of politics, to pursue different kinds of ends. So the terrorism as a brand, I don't think is owned by Daesh today. I think Daesh is just a part of this brand. It's a kind of terrorism, but it's not the one and only and end all for all terrorism. I don't believe that all terror groups are aspiring to be like Daesh, and I don't think all people who carry an ideology that's similar to Daesh's ideology, for example, are agreeing with the way Daesh approaches things. There are groups that disagree with the announcement of the caliphate and with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's appointment or self-appointment as the caliphate, and with their decision to announce a formal state. So there's not congruence, you could say, amongst the different jihadi groups, if you will. Allow me to use that word, on what this caliphate should look like, or what this Islamic State should be, actually. So I don't think that we should give them that much credit. I think putting it in those terms gives them more credit than they deserve. They've destroyed Syria. They've destroyed Iraq. They've done that with the help of people in high levels in both Iraq and Syria. They were conducting oil trade with the regime directly through regime affiliated individuals. They were conducting different kinds of negotiations for prisoner trades and other issues related to purchasing weapons, purchasing goods. You have to remember that they controlled a large amount of territory for more than 2 years. And they did this with millions of people living within that territory. They needed to get food, they needed to get water, they needed to get electricity, they needed supplies. All of that came from the authority kinds of structures that existed around them, which they maintained relationships with and developed those relationships with. So when Trump comes and he says that we're going to defeat Daesh on the ground, we're going to defeat Daesh ideologically, he's completely ignoring the root cause of the destruction and devastation that Daesh brought, which is that people are frustrated with the socioeconomic injustices that are happening in these two countries, both Syria and Iraq specifically. In Syria, the people tried to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. They were met with, various different kinds of, resistance from the regime, including using Daesh as a proxy force to destroy the momentum of the revolutionary actors. And in Iraq, we saw how Daesh swept through the country and used this sectarian rhetoric. So there's a lot of convoluted relationships that explain why Daesh is dangerous, but Trump's claim that Daesh is going to be defeated completely overlooks the fact that this group is rooted in the political and social fabric of the region in such a way that it's not going to be possible for Trump to pull out his troops from Syria or Iraq and say that Daesh is history.
Okay, we're going to have to leave that as our final, gentlemen, but of course we appreciate both of your time and your analysis and insight as you provided in this program. That was Dr. Yahya Al Aridi, Syrian politician, speaking to us from Strasbourg. He's part of the Syrian Negotiations Commission. We were also right at the end there hearing from Obaida Hitto, who is a political analyst, and he was speaking to us from Istanbul via Skype. Now, viewers, of course, this entire story about Trump's assertion that ISIS will be 100%, or territories, I should say, held by ISIS will possibly be liberated 100% by next week is quite a tall assertion to make. Plus, one has to question, does it even matter how much territory ISIS holds or does not hold? It's more about the ideology. And of course, as our guests, both of them spoke about, there is an argument and a debate about the roots of ISIS to begin with. Some would look to Syria's government itself or others. Others would look towards the West possibly and look for the founding of ISIS through proxies from either side, really. That's a debate that's up, of course, in the air at this point in time. But what's important is that a lot of innocent lives have been lost in this process. A lot of brutality has been shown on the part of ISIS through these ensuing years since it was founded and since the quote-unquote caliphate it founded was put in place as well. Is it on the down, or does it still have the ability to carry out brutal attacks? That's something that time will only tell. We'll keep a close eye on that here in The Scope. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and that has all been for this edition.